politics, and changing regional dynamics. And to introduce our resource speakers, ladies and gentlemen, let us all welcome Dr. Bill Hayton from the Chatham House. Let's give him a round of applause.
Well, welcome. Thank you very much for staying this long in the day. I hope you've had a decent break. What I'm going to try and do today is convince you that what may seem like very logical and historic claims made by China in the South China Sea are neither logical nor historical. Okay? This tends to get me into trouble with people in Beijing, but that's just the price you pay. But everything I say is going to be justified by documents, most of which are from Chinese sources. So I'm not making this up. Okay. I first started looking at this. My background, I was a BBC reporter in Vietnam in about 20 years ago. I then wrote a book about Vietnam. I then wrote a book on the South China Sea disputes. And then that led me into a whole series of arguments, which led to me doing more research and checking out some of the basic facts, and in the process finding a lot of documents that people had forgotten to look at for a long time. So I'm going to bring some of those to you tonight. But let's begin really just by asking, what are China's claims? Hang on, that's working. Not going forward, comrades. Point it this way. Yes, good on. That's the voice of experience, right? Okay, what are China's claims in the South China Sea? Well, we have one document which will help us. This was produced almost exactly 10 years ago, just after, or actually on the same day that the ruling of the Arbitral Tribunal was published. China published its statement on the South China Sea, and you see China's claims have 4 parts to them. This is the official Chinese Foreign Ministry website. China has sovereignty over Nanhai Jiudao. Okay, now this is a problem because Nanhai, South China Sea, Jiudao, archipelago. Okay, so China here is saying that there is one archipelago in the South China Sea which connects the Paracels in the north, Pratas between Taiwan and the mainland, Scarborough Shoal, and the Spratlys. Whereas, of course, anybody who can look at a nautical map knows that those are not connected together. There are vast deep seas in between them. So there isn't a single South Sea archipelago. So Dongsha is Pratas, Sisha is the Paracels, Zhongsha is, well, doesn't exist actually, and Nansha is the Spratlys. And then from that, China has internal waters, territorial sea, and a contiguous zone. But if they're trying to argue that that's one archipelago and that everything inside is internal waters, well, that very quickly runs into trouble with UNCLOS, as Professor Long explained about ratios and all the rest of it. China has exclusive economic zone and continental shelf. Well, that in itself isn't a problem, but if you base it on the idea that there is a single archipelago, then it is a problem. And then we come to this historic rights. China has historic rights in the South China Sea. That is the major problem, I would argue. In theory, the tribunal 10 years ago solved all of the maritime disputes. Okay, didn't address the territorial disputes. What's the difference between the two? Well, territorial disputes are about rocks and reefs. Maritime disputes are about the spaces in between the rocks and the reefs. Okay, I don't know if Professor Long agrees with that summary of the difference, but that's the simplistic way of putting it. So the questions are who actually owns the rocks and the reefs in the South China Sea. That really involves just the countries around the South China Sea. But the maritime disputes also bring in countries that care about international law, the US, Japan, the UK, Australia, etc. Okay, and in theory, they were all settled by the Arbitral Tribunal making the ruling that it did 10 years ago. China often talks about history and documents and why these documents prove that China owns the South China Sea. But China has a long history, 20th century history, of taking mentions of islands in old documents and then twisting those documents to serve modern ends. So, for example, here's a document published by the Chinese Foreign Ministry back in, I think, 2003, it says there, and it quotes this book, the Yuwuji, the Records of Rarities, published, nearly 2,000 years ago. And according to the Chinese website, it says there are islets and keys, sand keys, reefs and banks in the South China Sea. The water there is shallow and filled with magnetic rocks or stones. And according to them, this proves that China knew about the South China Sea and administered it 2,000 years ago. The only problem is that no one has ever seen this document. All we have are copies or copies of copies of copies, okay? And even the most recent, or even the oldest version of this, if you go back and look at it, and Professor Johannes Kurtz at the University of Heidelberg went back and translated it and said, this is the original entry. There are rugged stones in the sea where the water is shallow. Foreigners reinforce their big ships with metal. When they reach the strait, they cannot pass because of the magnetic stones. So actually, if you go back and you look at the original or the oldest extant version of this document, it completely undermines what modern China says it says, because it talks about foreigners sailing their ships through these seas. Okay, so we could go through dozens of documents in the same way, but my underlying point is that whenever a Chinese diplomat talks about looking at old documents and the old documents prove things, your first thought should be BS. Okay, if it actually says the name of an island and its location, take it seriously, but take it from me, none of them do. Okay, go back as far as 1870. Here's a map of Yunnan, Guangdong, Yunnan, this part, southwestern China, and you'll see a complete absence of islands. Okay, 1870. So China's interest in the South China Sea, from an official point of view, is very, very recent. Okay, of course, we can accept that fishermen from all around the region, from all of the coasts, all the way down, all around the Philippines, they used the sea, they sailed the sea. Pirates, used the sea, sailed the sea. Okay, there was trade, but there was a complete lack of state administration. Okay, so that's a kind of quick sketch of some of the common terms and arguments that China uses. But when we come to the present day, we're talking about this map, because this map was the first time that China actually published a map of its claims in the South China Sea and sent it to an international body. So May 2009, PRC submitted this map to the UN Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. And that was the very first time that in an international setting, it had advanced a map that had dashes like this around the South China Sea. And this map was the international version, if you like, of a map that was actually originally published in November 1947 by the Chinese Ministry of Interior, which has, in fact, 11 dashes on this map. These two here were removed in the 1950s. But this is the origin, really, of China's 9-dash line. So what I want to talk to you today is about how we got this map from this map. Where does this map come from, this 1947 claim line, and what does it actually mean? Well, that map that I showed you there was based upon a sketch map which was originally drawn for a meeting in September 1946. So in the aftermath of the Second World War, when Chinese officials were trying to work out where their territorial boundaries lay and what they should claim. And a meeting was called on the 25th of September, 1946. And the purpose of this meeting was to delimit the scope of what is received for the purpose of receiving each of the islands of the South China Sea. Now, these documents are in the Republic of China archives in Taiwan. Okay, and Chris Chung, who's a Canadian academic, published a very good article about that. This is where I get this information from a few years ago, and he looked at exactly what it said. And the important thing here is that it's about the reason this map was drawn was to talk about claiming the islands, i.e. which islands did China think it claimed. It's nothing to do with claiming historic waters or asserting that there's some kind of boundary in the South China Sea. All of that stuff comes much, much later in Chinese thinking. So the question is, why did they draw the line in this way around the South China Sea, stretching all the way down to the coast of Borneo and close to the Philippines over there. And I'm going to blame 4 men. Okay, this is not some ancient historical claim. This is a mistake for which these 4 men all bear some responsibility. In the 1930s, in the 1930s, in the 1940s, well, the 30s, and then in the 1940s. And the trigger for all of this was guano, bird poo. Okay, so this is the real reason why countries were interested in the South China Sea, or the islands of it, because there was a need for fertilizer, agricultural fertilizer, and particularly in Japan, business people were very active in going and seeking out sources of guano to be used for fertilizer at home. This only really lasted until the invention of the Haber-Bosch process, whereby you could then make fertilizer artificially. But during the 1910s and 20s, there was a huge interest in it. And particularly in 1907, a Japanese merchant called Nishizawa Yoshiji landed on Pratas Island in order to try and mine the guano and sell it back home. And this triggered a crisis with people in southern China getting very angry that a Japanese merchant was digging up guano on Pratas Island. And this obviously comes at a time when Chinese nationalists were getting very upset about foreigners, about the British, the French, everybody else kind of grabbing bits of China and all the rest of it. So that's the origin of it. But in fact, what happened in 1909 was that there was a boycott of Japanese products in southern China, and the Japanese government asked the Qing government, they said, well, if you can prove that this island, Pratas, belongs to China, then we will hand it over. And that set off a massive rush for what I call the scraping of documents. This is where the whole idea of going back and looking at old documents, trying to find mentions of the word island, and then using that in a kind of legalistic kind of way comes from. And in the end, they found a document which mentioned this island. The Japanese government was prepared to give it up, but actually the Chinese authorities, the Qing dynasty as it was, paid the Japanese merchant, Mr. Yoshiji, for his expenses for having interrupted his guano mining venture. But that was the first time that any Chinese government took any interest in any of the islands of the South China Sea. And then in 1909, we see for the very first time, a map of Guangdong province published by the Chinese authorities, which actually shows the parasols. So we say the first time that China officially showed any interest in any of the South China Sea islands was 1909, and they were only interested in the parasols at that point. But then what happened, this is all to do with, this is the expedition that was sent down there, and there was a huge wave of enthusiasm in southern China that they were going to take over these islands, that they were going to be very sort of rich. But in the end, they realized that there's almost nothing in the parasols. And so they, within weeks, they were abandoning the plans, and they talked about maybe just turning them into a prison colony. That was all they could think of to use them for. And then immediately after the nationalist revolution, so there's the bit when it says they're thinking of using them as a penal settlement. But almost immediately after, Chinese authorities forgot about the parasols, and even in the 1920s, international merchants sailing across the South China Sea were complaining that the parasols were a death trap because nobody was looking after them, there was no lighthouse there was no administration or whatever. So far from China having been in continuous occupation and administration, it's very clear that China basically took no interest in the Parasol Islands, or any other islands, frankly, during the 1920s. What changes is changes in the international situation. And obviously, in China, you have the revolution, you have a nationalist government in 1928, you have the so-called Nanjing decade, 1928, 1937. And at the same time, Japan enlarges its possessions and then invades Manchuria. And so there are various different crises going on around East Asia. And it's in the middle of all this that China's South China Sea claims start to emerge. And there are different things going on. So there are rival claims emerging to the Paracels. In particular, you've got a sort of three-way tussle between China, Japan, and France going on. And then you've also got separate claims being made in the Spratly Islands to the south, which really only involve France and Japan to a degree. So there's no Chinese interest in the Spratly Islands at this time. Okay, but what this does, and I'm cutting a long story short, is it creates an interest in China for wanting to define the limits of China's territorial claims. So the Republic of China Maps Inspection Committee is set up in June 1933. And this period of the summer of 1933 is a critical moment, really, for the emergence of China's claims in the South China Sea. Because in July 1933, France publishes its claim to six, there we are, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of the Spratly Islands in its newspaper, in the Journal Officiel, okay? And this sets off a total panic in China. And the main reason it sets off a panic is because the Chinese government doesn't know where the Spratly Islands are, okay? So this is from a Taiwanese, an ROC document published in Taiwan, and here we have the Minister of Navy. So the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has sent a telegram to all the other ministries to say, do you know where these islands are that the French have claimed? And the Ministry of the Navy says, there are no islands at this location between the Philippines and Vietnam. Okay? The islands in the Philippines are further north, referring to the Paracels. So at this point, 1933, the Chinese Navy does not know about the existence of the Spratly Islands. Okay, it's quite important to understand this. Okay, so they have to then make a kind of investigation of the various maps and documents around. And at this point, this guy, Li Jun, he was the admiral that commanded those expeditions to claim the Paracels in 1909. He pops up and he writes a letter, an article in the Chinese newspapers saying, I'm sure that these islands that the French have grabbed are the same islands that I led a voyage to in 1909. He was wrong, okay? But he sets up a belief in some Chinese official circles that China claimed the Spratly Islands back in 1909, and they never did. Okay, he was mistaken. That was the first mistake. There's then a whole summer of investigation, and in fact, one of the ways that the Chinese government clears up the problem is that their ambassador here in Manila goes to see the Americans, the naval attaché gets a map from the Americans and then realizes that these are two completely separate groups of islands, and then sends the message back to Nanjing. And that causes the Chinese Foreign Ministry, and this is the text of the Gazette of the Chinese Foreign Ministry from September 1933, and it basically tells its readers that Dongsha, Pratas Island, and Xisha, the Paracels, have always been part of our country's territory. Well, we can argue about that. They have been ignored by their compatriots, so that means they haven't been occupied or administered the usual way you claim territory, because these two places are situated in the southern wilderness, okay? But there is no claim to the Spratlys at all. So in 1933, the Chinese government declined to claim the Spratly Islands. It asserted it only had a claim to the Paracels and to Pratas Island as late as 1933, okay? And if you want further evidence of this, okay, they produced in the same edition of the Foreign Ministry Gazette a list of all the islands with their English names, international names, and the Chinese names. And Triton Island here is known in China, is given the name Nanjidao, southernmost island. And there's an explanation here, because it is the southernmost point of the South China Sea, it is named southernmost island, okay? So that's the most southerly point that China claims is Triton Island in the Paracels, okay? So double proof that China didn't claim the Spratly Islands or Scarborough Shoal or anything at that time. Okay? There's then a process going on, this what they call the Land and Water Maps Review or Maps Inspection Committee. Their English names are all named after managers of the East India Company. So you get Roberts Island, Duncan Island, Pattle Island, Money Island. They were all managers of the British East India Company, because it was the East India Company that sponsored the surveys of the islands. Now, some of those, they simply transliterated the names into a sort of Chinese equivalent. But Money Island, which is named after a man called William Money, was given the Chinese name Jinyin Dao, because Jinyin is simply the Chinese word for money. And to this day, the Chinese name for Money Island is Jinyin Dao. They continue to honor an imperialist from the East India Company today in the official Chinese name for the island. But for example, Scarborough Shoal, they didn't know what a Scarborough was, so it became Sigobaolo, simply the Chinese way of saying Scarborough. Where did this list come from? Well, I've worked it out because there are various features that don't actually exist. We now know, having had better surveys, that there are some features which were sort of mistakes in some of the early international maps. And so their list of mistakes is exactly the same as the list of mistakes that was published in this document, the China Sea Directory, which was published by the UK Hydrographic Office. So basically all the Chinese government did at this point, or this committee, was take lists like this and maps and copy the information. They were not doing their own voyages of discovery. They were simply copying the international information and then trying to make it fit with Chinese names. And some of these Chinese names are kind of obvious. So, for example, North Danger becomes Beixian, simply North Danger. Spratly Island becomes Cibalatuo, Spratly. Money Island I just talked about. Antelope Reef, named after a British ship called the Antelope, becomes Linyangjiao. There are no antelopes that live there. Linyang is just the Chinese word for antelope, okay? But it's worth saying, so there was a name that was given by the committee in 1935. In 1947, after the Second World War, some of those names were changed. And then in 1983, the communists government gave some of the names, some of the features, different names. So for example, Scarborough Shoal is an important one because it's Sigobaolo in 1935. In 1947, the nationalist government calls it Democracy Reef, Minzujiao. Okay, not a very kind of natural name that you would call. It's not like a fisherman would call it, but anyway, Minzujiao for a few years. But then the communist government decided that they didn't want it to be called Democracy Reef, so it changed its name to Huanyang, Yellow Rock, which is the name it has now. So the next time a Chinese official tells you that China was the first to name this, well, ask them how long Scarborough Shoal has been called Huanyang, and it's about 40 years. But this caused other problems further down south because this committee didn't know how to translate the English word shoal, so Scarborough Shoal or James Shoal. Shoal is an old English word, it just means shallow, okay? There's nothing actually there to see, it just means the sea is shallow. But they didn't know how to translate this, so they chose the word tan, okay? Now in Chinese, a tan is a sandbank, and a sandbank can be above the water, you could see it, or it could be below the water. It's an ambiguous term. So some of these things became known as, for example, James Shoal becomes Zhengmu Tan. Zhengmu here is just the transliteration. Zhengmu is like JM, James. It's how you would say James in Chinese. But they called it a tan, okay? So when people looked at this name, they thought, well, is that an island or not? They had no way of knowing from this word, tan. And the problem was, along comes this man, Bai Mei Chu. He was a professor of geography at Beijing Normal University. He'd never been given any formal training in geography. He was just a passionate nationalist who liked maps. And he published in 1936 what he called the New Atlas of China's Construction. There's a copy of its cover there. And this guy is responsible for most of the mistakes in the South China Sea, unfortunately. His legacy, 90 years on, is one of chaos and conflict, unfortunately. So in his atlas, he published a big map showing what he thought were China's boundaries here. And you can see it includes Tibet and Mongolia and all of these places. Interestingly, it doesn't include Taiwan. You'll be interested to see there. This is from 1936 because, of course, this time Taiwan is a colony of Japan. Anyway, so he draws this line, which goes all the way down here, all the way down to Borneo and around here in the same kind of direction as the 9-dash line does now. And then if you zoom in, you can look at it here, you'll see that his line goes all the way down to an island here, includes an island here and an island here. Okay, but these islands don't actually exist. In fact, none of these islands in the middle here exist at all. This is a work of imagination, not of reality. So this is Zhengmu Tan. This is James Shoal down here. This is Chanwei Tan. Chanwei is just the Chinese word for vanguard. So that's Vanguard Bank, again named after a British ship. He's just translated the name. This is Haima Tan, Seahorse Shoal, British ship, the seahorse that plotted its location in the 19th century. But none of these features actually exist. They're all underwater features, okay? So why did the guy who drew this map, Bai Mei-chu, why did he make them into islands? Well, this is, I think, and this is my theory, no one has yet proved me wrong, okay, is that he simply copied a British map, okay? So I think he copied this map here, because this map was published in London in 1918, and you'll see the James Shoal, the Vanguard Bank, Seahorse Bank are marked, but they're marked with little dotted lines, which, if you understand the map making here, means that they're just areas of submerged, they're just areas of shallow sea, they're underwater, okay? But he misunderstood this, and he thought that, just like Natuna here, that this was an island. So he drew them as islands, and then he drew his big line all the way around them, okay? And that is unfortunately the sad and silly origin of China's 9-dash line, is to claim non-existent islands as territory. We can talk a bit more about some of the background to that, if you like. But you have to remember that that was only his claim, okay? He's just a geography professor who published an atlas. Okay, this was not a claim that was adopted by the Chinese government, and in fact, no one did anything about this claim. It was only in the aftermath of the Second World War that this map took on any significance, really, politically, internationally. During the Second World War, you'll be aware of something called the Cairo Declaration. Now, this was agreed between the leaders of the US, the UK, and China, Chiang Kai-shek at the time. And often you will hear Chinese spokespeople saying that the Cairo Declaration promised the islands of the South China Sea to China after the Second World War. People who say that have clearly not read the Cairo Declaration, okay? Because it says, basically, it is their purpose, this is the allies, the US, UK, China at this point, Japan shall be stripped of the islands of the Pacific which has been seized or occupied, and that all the territories Japan has stolen from the Chinese, and it lists here Manchuria, Formosa, i.e. Taiwan, and the Pescadores. Okay, so only 3 bits of territory, Manchuria, Formosa, and the Pescadores, will be returned to the Republic of China. Okay, full stop. Japan will also be expelled from other territories, but it doesn't say anything about who's going to get them. Okay, so in no way did the Cairo Declaration say anything at all about the Spratlys, the Paracels, or Pratas Island, for that matter. Okay, so again, when you hear a Chinese diplomat tell you that, just ask them to show you the text of the Cairo Declaration, and they will be embarrassed. But Bai Mei-chu's legacy was to go on and have major geopolitical impact because of these 2 men. These 2 men were students of Bai Mei-chu during the 1930s. They studied geography with him. And then they went on to become academics in China. And actually, in the 1930s, he went to study in Germany in the 1930s, and he went to study in Japan in the 1930s, where they learnt the kind of things that you would learn in 1930s Germany and Japan. But they came back with some very fixed ideas about nation and territory and all the rest of it. And after the Second World War, when China was thinking about the land that it should claim, where its boundaries were going to be in the aftermath of the war, the government called upon these 2 geography professors to help them decide which islands should be claimed. And they were on the committee that met on the 25th of September 1946, and it was them that drew that sketch map, okay? So now you're starting to see how the mistakes of a geography professor in 1936, which were based on bad translations of a Chinese committee in 1935, and then passed on to these people, then go on to inform how the Republic of China makes its claim in the South China Sea after the Second World War. Okay, and here you can see that Fu Jiaojin was one of the people on board the Chinese expedition to the Spratly Islands, which landed there in December 1946. So the 12th of December 1946 was the first time any Chinese official ever landed on any of the Spratly Islands and made a claim to those islands. And you can see the down here for the first time, a long, long way from the Paracels up here. And then in the aftermath of that expedition, that's when this map was published, and you can see that the confusion about Zhengmu Tan is still there. But by then they realized actually that this is not a real feature. So the name has been changed to Zhengmu Ansha, which means hidden sand, which is a better translation really of shoal. So today it's called Zhengmu Ansha, but its origin is in the name Zhengmu Tan. And that's the reason why the line comes all the way down this far south. But even after that expedition had gone down to the southern part of the South China Sea, there were still arguments within China, within the Chinese government, about what should be claimed. And the commander of the expedition, himself, Colonel Lin Zun, basically said, we should keep looking at this question about whether we should claim the Spratlys. And basically he sort of says that they're much closer to the Philippines and to Vietnam than they are to China, and I don't think we've got a very good claim. But he was overruled, and finally in April 1947, the Chinese government decided that the southernmost point of Chinese territory was reaffirmed as being, well, reaffirmed. I would quibble, I think they invented it for the first time as being the James Shoal. So that was the big decision point, April 1947. And you can see the proof of this in a document, a book published by the Republic of China government in two editions. There was an edition in 1943, and then there was a second edition 4 years later. And the point of this book, the China Handbook, was to sort of introduce China to English-speaking audiences around the world, how big the country was, what its mineral resources were, you could come and invest in there, that sort of thing. And page 1, it says, it describes the geography of China, and it says the territory extends from the mountains in the north to Triton Island of the Paracel Group. Okay, July 1943, China's claims only go as far south as the Paracel Group. But by the time they produce the second edition 4 years later, they've suddenly advanced the frontiers by about 1,000 kilometers to include what were then called the Tuansha Islands. At that time, that was what they called the Spratlys. And even then, they admitted that these islands are contested between China, the Commonwealth of the Philippines, and Indochina. Okay, so just the same book, two editions, 4 years apart, you can see that the Chinese claim has shifted south dramatically. And this is important because, right now, these locations of these non-existent islands are where most of the hot situations are in the South China Sea. This is close to Malampaya and Reed Bank, the gas fields that the Philippines would like to extract. This is down towards the Luconia Shoals, which has got gas fields that Malaysia is extracting and comes into conflict with China from time to time. And over here, the Vanguard Bank, this is where Vietnam tried to drill gas with a Spanish company called Repsol, and then was forced to cancel the exploration and the drilling. And this all goes back to these non-existent islands and the 9-dash line. If we were to pretend that the 9-dash line didn't exist, and you could actually then just draw a line around the actual real features of the South China Sea, the ones that actually stick out above the sea, you could draw a line hypothetically like this, taking into account their 12 nautical mile territorial seas. And you would see that that would shrink the disputed area dramatically, and it would mean that there would be no dispute, for example, for the Philippines to get the gas out of the Reed Bank here, or Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam here. That's the sort of logical, shared and disputed area. This 9-dash line is not logical at all. Okay, I will then move on quickly to the fourth part. Remember the claim that was talked about in the Chinese document from 10 years ago, the historic rights claim. Okay, so the whole idea of historic rights is actually not very historic. It comes from this man, Professor Fu Quanchen, who was an academic / politician in Taiwan in the late 1980s, early 1990s. He was a member of what was called the New Party. When the Kuomintang was debating its policy on whether it was going to be, more in favor of Taiwanese autonomy, he was a real kind of diehard that there's only one China, that we shouldn't relax the policy. And actually, he left the Kuomintang to form this thing called the New Party, which were very rigid in their one China approach. And he used the maritime issue as a way of trying to kind of win support and damage the Kuomintang. And in doing so, he took a very strange position on international law. It was him who came up with the idea that this 9-dash line gave China historic rights, the rights to the fish, the navigation, the oil and gas within this claim. That was something that the Chinese government did not claim in 1946, had not claimed beforehand. It was his own invention. So this man, Professor Fu Quanchen, has done more to damage peace and regional stability than anybody else I know in contemporary Asia, okay? He should be given the Ig Nobel Prize, I think. So the historic rights claim, the problem is that even though it was just a couple of guys who came up with it, it transfers the idea from Taiwan actually into the PRC in the 1990s. And actually, Professor Fu Quanchen goes and gets a teaching job in Xiamen University. And unfortunately, in 1998, the Chinese law on the exclusive economic zone includes the phrase China's historic rights. Okay, so unfortunately, his influence went on to cause China to actually write the term historic rights into its legislation, which it should never have been. And then we can see that China has tried to stretch the meaning of historic rights and then to deploy other arguments as well. So in the wake of the arbitral tribunal ruling 10 years ago, China started to float various other ideas, including the idea of their 4 shahs. And what they mean by this is the 4 archipelagos, the Spratlys, the Paracels, Pratas, and what they call Zhongsha, and then claim that each of them, even if they were not individually capable of supporting human habitation and therefore deserving of an exclusive economic zone, that if you put them in groups, that collectively they could claim an exclusive economic zone, which could then be basically as big as the U-shaped line. Now, just a quick word on Zhongsha. Okay, so China talks about the Zhongsha as some kind of archipelago in the center of the South China Sea, but in fact, there's only one feature that actually sticks above the water, which is Scarborough Shoal, which just stands entirely on its own. They then connect that to a number of other features, the Macclesfield Bank in particular, which is just an underwater feature. It has nothing that sticks up above the surface. So they continue to pretend that this is an island, going back to Bai Meiqiu's bad maps, when in fact there's nothing of the sort. There is no such thing as the Zhongsha. Okay, there's no central archipelago in the South China Sea, yet China continues to pretend it exists. That would be the impact of a 4 shahs claim, and you see it would have this more or less the same effect as the U-shaped line claim. Has no basis in UNCLOS either, but it's another piece of lawfare. I think there is a problem that China is going to be doubling down on its claim that underwater features can be territory. So from time to time, Chinese ships go down to the James Shoal and they throw a brick over the side of the ship, which says this is China's territory, and they have a ceremony like this. But as you can see, there's absolutely no territory there. Perhaps if they throw enough bricks over the side, then maybe something will get bigger. And then you get things like this, people taking their diving expedition and saying, this is China. So I think that's something that you have to be alert for, is the possibility that China will try to reverse engineer international law to make sense of the fact that it made a stupid claim, 50, 70 years ago. Okay, I think that's the end. Okay, this little thing, okay. In theory, okay, I reckon you could solve the South China Sea disputes from a territorial perspective in an afternoon, yeah? None of this, no need for all this bashing ships into one another thing. If this is the island of Pedra Branca between Singapore and Malaysia, and Singapore and Malaysia took a case. They both agreed to take a case to the International Court of Justice to work out the sovereignty of these features. And in this case, the ICJ was able to work out that basically these little rocks and reef things here belong to Malaysia, but because Singapore had built a lighthouse and administered this one, Pedra Branca, that this one belonged to Singapore. Okay, so if the ICJ can separate features that are that close to each other, okay, it's not impossible for them to do the same thing across the whole of the South China Sea, because we have pretty good evidence, really, of the history of occupation and claims now. So I don't think that would be too difficult at all. So my message to China really is to stop the BS, just settle down. We can resolve the disputes in an afternoon, and we can all go home and do something else. Okay, thanks very much. I think this is where you're supposed to ask me questions. Okay. Hello. Do you want? Yes. Do you want? Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that my question is a little bit departing from your analysis today, but please allow me to ask it. In 2016, the award rendered by the tribunal found that rights claimed by China over the sea are not sovereignty over sea zones. They are rights to fish, rights to develop natural resources, and right of navigation, if my memory correctly serves me. So, your excellent analysis today, what influence does it have on this finding of arbitral award? If I can hear your opinion on this, I would be most grateful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And this is another of those things that Chinese officials like to say, was that the arbitral ruling interfered with China's territorial rights. But it's literally on the first page of the ruling that the tribunal says it has no competence to rule on territorial issues. So it's only concerning itself with maritime rights, with the rights to resources and freedom of navigation and maritime issues. So it's that has been distorted by Chinese officials in their response to it, and I guess it's a way of dodging the main impact of the award, which is to basically say that the U-shaped line, the 9-dash line, has no basis in international law, cannot be used to claim resources, and therefore cannot be used to prevent countries like, well, it's only binding on China and the Philippines, cannot be used by China to prevent the Philippines developing the resources in its exclusive economic zone. I suppose what my research does is to sort of show that the territorial claims are so much weaker, and that the U-shaped 9-dash line is itself based on misunderstandings. So I think there were some aspects of my research that the tribunal saw, but I think Clive Schofield, who's speaking here tomorrow, had much greater input, I think, into some of the court's kind of deliberations on that. But yeah, I mean, I think taken together, they are a sustained critique of the Chinese position on that. Yeah. Mr. Giuliano. So I think I can see a microphone coming up.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you for this afternoon's very enlightening presentation. Really, my question here, this might sound simple or belaboring the obvious, but I'm kind of wondering, since you provided this detailed debunking, if you will, of the Chinese argument, do we see any possibility in the future that the Chinese government departs from this line of argument and make other claims or invest in other narratives, or do you get the impression that they've invested too much in this already, that they cannot dispose of it at risk of losing flat out credibility, not just in the international space but to their own domestic audiences? No? So like, is this just the lie that they cannot afford to disengage with anymore, or are they beginning to? I'm kind of wondering what's your sense of what's happening inside. Thank you.
I mean, I think they do change their arguments from time to time, and we hear less of the 2,000 years of history type argument now. I think I'm right in saying we probably hear less of the Cairo Declaration now. I think I could be wrong on that. If it's people who've had contacts with Chinese diplomats might have a different impression. So I think their arguments do respond to the critique sometimes. But sometimes it just depends on which diplomats you speak to, and the last time they went to a Chinese Foreign Ministry training session, and kind of how up to date their arguments are. But I think that to a degree now, they're just taking a might is right approach. We're here, and you can't stop us. And I'm not sure. I mean, you do get these sort of vague references to China was the first to name, the first to develop, the first to occupy the islands, but very little in terms of specifics, because I think they know they can't defend it. I mean, the response that I get, or the response that I've occasionally had, is that Mr. Hayton hasn't seen all of the documents, so therefore he doesn't understand the Chinese claim. But then they don't actually produce these documents that I should see in order to better understand the Chinese claim. So I'm not convinced that they exist really, or if or that they say what the Chinese officials really say that they say. I mean, my own view is that I think China is determined to hang on, and to close off access to the central part of the South China Sea, and that's as much to do with its desire to create a bastion for its ballistic nuclear missile submarines as it is to do with historic rights. But I think it's important because I think that this historical narrative that they have kind of underpins their sense of correctness and rightness, that in fact that they aren't being imperialistic and grabbing territory, but in fact that this is their own territory that they're just reclaiming. So I think that the most, whatever we can do to describe China's actions as colonial, imperialist, revanchist, territory grabbing, these kind of things, is the way to embarrass them and to show the world that there's no logical sense to it, and kind of undermine this sense of moral superiority. I think there's somebody in front of you. Yeah. Is it not working? Right.
Hello.
Hello.
So good afternoon. So this is just a question out of curiosity, if you've done any additional research on it. But do you think that a similar methodology of the PRC taking basically ancient documents and claiming pieces of land off of it has been used in other territorial disputes that it has, for example, against India or even against like Nepal and Bhutan?
So what were those last two examples?
My main example though is India, since that's the one that I most know of. Right.
I mean, I presume. I I haven't advised any other international legal cases, but I presume all states that put a territorial claim, have some kind of basis for it. And those are then, when it comes to testing them, the ICJ or mainly the ICJ, then they put their bits of evidence down on paper and they provide the sources and all the rest of it. And that was the basis that Malaysia and Singapore operated in the Pedro Branca case. Malaysia, gained the sovereignty over the Sipadan Ligatan case with Indonesia, and you've had other cases around the world. So the thing to do is to actually test them and to provide evidence. And it's interesting to think about why China doesn't do that. Is it fundamentally because they know their evidence is weak, or is it more of a sort of outlook thing? We are a great power, and we do not allow international, courts to, to take us to task and to rule against us, because that's not what great powers do. So I think there's a kind of, psychological aspect to it as well. And of course, the fact that China is a big and powerful country means it's very hard to compel China to do something like that. Whereas a country, other countries, could be potentially compelled. There was a time when the embarrassment factor of international law made even powerful states sort of behave themselves. So if you go all the way back to the 1980s and the case against the US for mining the harbors of Nicaragua, the US didn't comply, but then it did comply. Yeah, it stopped mining the harbors of Nicaragua. Russia released the Arctic Sunrise. Yeah, it might be the whole thing. It's become a bit sort of politicized at the moment, but the UK was making the right, making moves to comply with international law about Diego Garcia and the Chagos Islands until it became a massive domestic issue last year. So yeah, international law did have some sort of compelling powers, but China has sort of refused to go along with the general movement in this direction. And that's just obviously been a major factor in the weakening of international law generally, say in the last 5-10 years. At the back over there.
Thank you. First of all, I'm a big fan of your book. And as you mentioned in your book and in your presentation this afternoon, you said that China's claims is essentially based on what was claimed by the Republic of China in the late 40s. Republic of China is Taiwan now. And in your book, you said that it would make it a lot easier if Taiwan would set the record straight, that they made a mistake in the 40s. It can actually persuade China to change their tune as well. Have you seen any indications on the Taiwanese government today? If have they made the efforts or indications that they are recanting what their previous government claimed in the 40s? Thank you.
Good question. I guess the answer is no. I mean, I think it would be contentious for a couple of reasons. One is it's the kind of thing that the government on Taiwan could only do once. Yeah. If they kind of renounced the claim, published the documents, said this, then that's it. That's out in the international arena and could be used as evidence in some kind of case. So why do it for nothing? Yeah, you'd probably want to get, if you were Taiwan, and you might want to get something in exchange for that, major change in your position. So would another country be willing to offer Taiwan something? Well, I suppose they could recognize Taiwan independence, but that might start World War III. So there's there are kind of maybe things that could be done along the way. And of course, it might, my understanding of domestic politics on Taiwan is not good enough to be able to know what kind of domestic implications that would have in terms of, you know, the stability of the various parties, and almost certainly, I imagine there would be retaliation from the PRC about that. So I can think of lots of reasons why Taiwan wouldn't do it, even though, you know, in the interests of international, you know, clarity, it would be a very nice thing for them to do. Yeah, I mean, it's there. They have made their archives publicly available. So it's, you know, people like Chris Chung and myself have done some digging in the archives, and in effect, we have the information already. But what would be missing would be that sort of official step. But you know, I don't think there are many upsides for Taiwan to do that, and there probably could be quite a few downsides.
Hi, thank you very much. Good afternoon. Uh, may I just ask your thoughts on this idea that um, uh, the idea that the core of Chinese foreign policy is on regime survival, and that is the survival of the Chinese Communist Party, for that matter, and that these actions, these conscious actions in the South China Sea, are a reflection of the Chinese Communist Party's narrative to legitimate their governance of China, for that matter, and to an extent that this is something related to their survival, to their reason for existence in the very first place. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, and this can also be a diplomatic talking point by the PRC, which is, you know, of course we'd love to compromise, but the people will, you know, they wouldn't go with it, you know, so we're kind of at the mercy of our people. I don't really buy that. I mean, the PRC is the world's most successful propaganda state. Yeah, I mean, they've got 80 years of experience of managing public opinion, massaging it in certain ways. Let's be friendly to Japan, let's be unfriendly to Japan, etc., etc. So yeah, while there is a, you know, there is definitely a concern about, you know, letting the pressure go off and, you know, things getting out of control. It's not impossible for the PRC to do that. I mean, they're very practiced at managing public opinion. And, you know, they're also very practiced about using public opinion to send messages to to their counterparts when in negotiations and all the rest of it. So, yeah, I don't believe this line that the PRC would love to compromise, but that it's fearful of its own population. Yes, the idea of inheriting the sort of the true nationalism of China from the ROC, from the Kuomintang, has been a part of the Communist Party's narrative. But, you know, they have made compromises on other frontiers, for example, in elsewhere. I mean, in earlier times, to be sure, but it hasn't been a kind of maximalist, you know, push for everything that the ROC claimed. But I mean, there is a part of it which is definitely to do with regime survival. I mean, and if you remember that the PLA, the Chinese military, is the Communist Party's military. It's not the country's military, yeah? So it belongs to the party. And so therefore, the nuclear missile submarines are the leadership's last line of defense. And so if the party military leadership thinks that, you know, you got to have the South China Sea in order to have the place for the missiles to be hidden, then they're going to hang on to it. Yeah, or it's going to be, you know, it's going to be contested. So, I mean, I think that their, you know, desire to defend the top leadership will be strong, and I think that the historical narrative allows them to sort of present that as being historically correct and morally right and all the rest of it. But I think at the end of the day, it's about force and power. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Hello. Good afternoon, Professor. I would just like to ask your idea on this. The Philippine ASEAN chairmanship just started this year, and there's a hope of generating a code of conduct on the area. So, do you think ASEAN might be able to generate a stronger historical narrative if we pull our narratives and evidences together on the disputed areas? And what are the challenges you are seeing with this approach if ever we pull our historical evidences together as a region? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really two really good questions. One is about the COC, and then is about ASEAN states working together. I mean, I would love to see the ASEAN claimants, so Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, work together to have an understanding. And I mean, it would require, I think, those four countries in particular to begin, to say, we recognize in effect your de facto occupation. I mean, maybe small steps. You wouldn't necessarily go straight into de jure recognition, but to make it clear that there's an understanding that the current holdings, aren't going to be changed. I mean, that might be difficult. From the Philippines would have to accept that the island, the Southwest Key that the Vietnamese stole in 1974-5, they're not going to get back. Malaysia had to do the same thing because the Vietnamese grabbed Amboina Key. But maybe just as a means of settling the disputes among themselves, that would be the way to go. And then once they have agreed to recognize each other's holdings, then the pressure is, becomes a more ASEAN versus China pressure. Of course, China will object. China will say that none of this can be settled without Chinese participation. But wouldn't stop ASEAN, those four ASEAN states, working out a modus vivendi among themselves. I mean, you could say that in effect, the wording of the DOC back in 2002, in effect, was wording that was about recognizing the de facto situation, not changing the status quo. So could you then go a step forward in terms of actually kind of increasing the strength of that language? I think it would be a good thing to do. In terms of the COC generally, I've long been a skeptic about the chances of a COC. I mean, fundamentally, the ASEAN states want a code of conduct to constrain China's behavior, and China doesn't want to have its behavior constrained. So why would it sign? I think more than that, China sees a COC as a means of constraining the United States' behavior. And what I mean by that is that China keeps on trying to put text into the COC such that none of the signatories, none of the 12 signatories, the 11 member states of ASEAN now plus China, would be able to conduct military exercises with a country from outside the region, i.e. the US or Japan, without the consent of everybody, i.e. China would have to agree. And the same thing with oil and gas exploration, that none of the companies based in Southeast Asia would be able to work with a company from outside the region without everybody agreeing, i.e. China. So in effect, if the Southeast Asian states, if ASEAN states agree to that, in effect, they're giving China a veto over US or Japanese or European or whatever military exercises in the region, and also oil and gas exploration. And that, of course, is something that ASEAN states are not going to agree to. So I think the same old issues are just going to keep going round and round and round and round and round and round. And we may get we've had a DOC, we've had guidelines on a DOC, we've had a single draft negotiating text. ASEAN is very good with coming up with new names for the same old document, frankly. So that's probably what they're going to have to. That's what the DFA is doing right now, is thinking of a new name for an interim document on the COC.
Hello. Hi, Bill. Good afternoon. I'd just like to take the opportunity to ask if you can enlighten us more, perhaps, on the trends in Chinese claims concerning low tide elevations, even more so, maybe submerged features. Because I think in many instances, it has downplayed the ruling in the 2016 Arbitral Award, saying that low tide elevations and obviously submerged features are not capable of appropriation by any state, which is weird because this is just a pronouncement of an earlier ruling, like in Qatar versus Bahrain. But I think in 2024, they also published trait baselines in the Scarborough Shoal in Bajo de Masinloc, which is, as you mentioned, part of what they claim as the Chongsha sand islands in that area. But we know that Scarborough Shoal is within the vicinity of submerged features. But instead of drawing perhaps baselines along those submerged features, it seems that China chose to isolate their claim on the Scarborough and detach it from what they claim as the Chongsha. So maybe you can shed more light about perhaps changes or trends in terms of how they position themselves on LTEs and submerged features. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. A good and technical question. I mean, I guess you could see those straight baselines as a good thing in some ways, apart from the fact that they're drawing baselines around a feature to which they don't really have a strong claim of sovereignty. But they are not at that point sort of reverse engineering international law to legitimize a claim to submerged features. But I think it's something we have to keep an eye out every time Chinese side produces a map, which includes submerged features. Then it's a kind of little step towards a time perhaps in the future when PRC says that it recognizes claims over underwater territory, as they might say. I mean, it is possibly another a good sign is, a few years ago, there was lots of talk about China declaring an ADIZ, an Air Defense Identification Zone, over the Spratly Islands. And that seemed to come to nothing. And I think one of the reasons why it came to nothing was because it would have forced them to have actually drawn a line around their territorial claims. And were they going to include the James Shoal in that? Which would have then, in effect, crystallized a claim to an underwater feature, and the rest of the world could have got, that's an underwater feature, you can't make it. And so, or they would have had to have just drawn a line, like I showed on that map, around the above water features and said, this is our claim to territory, which would have undermined the 9-dash line to a degree. So I think that went away because their map makers couldn't work, and their politicians couldn't work out exactly what they wanted to claim. So, I mean, that's a benign interpretation of the lack of an air defense identification zone or baselines in the Spratlys. But I think anybody watching this area has to be on guard, because I'm pretty sure they would love to claim underwater features just to sort of make their nonsense claims slightly more sensical, if you like. Mr. Ray Powell.
Let's see if this thing works.
Mm. No red lights.
Test. Okay, this one works. Thank you. So China already uses language out of the 2002 Declaration on the Conduct of Parties of the South China Sea as a basis to say that the arbitral process was invalid because the Philippines failed to carry out bilateral consultations and dialogues as the DOC implies. Based on that as sort of the historical record and current record, because it remains their argument today, is it possible that a COC would only result in a further pretext for China to be able to say the terms of UNCLOS as they apply to the South China Sea are invalid because we have this new COC, that we, the regional players, have all agreed on, and that international global body, UNCLOS, is no longer applicable in this region.
I guess they would love that, wouldn't they? And I suppose that's why, it's really important that, when ASEAN produces its statements at summits or whatever, or these interim documents, that it says, grounded in UNCLOS of 1982 and international law, and all the rest of it. I'm sure the Philippine side here would give us plenty of evidence that they did try, quite hard to talk to China before launching the tribunal process in 2013, and got nowhere. So I think that sort of negates this argument that that the DOC would have kind of invalidated the tribunal proceedings. But yeah, I think I'd love, I think the PRC would love something that basically said, these are disputes that need to be resolved, bilaterally or whatever, because that allows a big country to lean very heavily on a smaller country. I would love to see someone, whenever a Chinese spokesperson pops up and says, these disputes must be settled by negotiation between the relevant parties. Well, ask them, what are they prepared to negotiate about? Is it just how quickly the Philippines surrenders? Or are they actually prepared to negotiate on the substantive issues, territorial claims, maritime delimitation? What actually is it that China wants to negotiate about? That would be the question that I would ask them whenever they say that.
Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to say thank you to Dr. Bill Hayton for that very comprehensive lecture on the modern origins of China's South China Sea claims. Truly, the participants better understood the weaknesses, contradictions, and political issues of PRC's historical arguments while situating them against the legal framework of the UNCLOS and the findings of the 2016 Arbitral Award. Ladies and gentlemen, that wraps up the sessions proper of our National West Philippine Sea Summit. We extend our sincere gratitude to our distinguished resource persons, esteemed guests, partners, and all participants for your valuable presence and active engagement throughout today's discussions. Once again, maraming salamat at magandang hapon po sa ating lahat. We will be seeing each other later at 1745 Hotel or at 5:45 p.m. for our commemorative dinner. Thank you.